welcome to this podcast episode discussing the current proposed peace plans for ending the war in Ukraine. Now, the first plan that we're going to be discussing is the American-Russian proposal. This proposal was negotiated between Steve Witkoff, who's been Trump's kind of unofficial peace envoy for wherever he's been trying to negotiate peace agreements. Witkoff did work first in the Middle East and has been working now with Russia for quite a while. And Kirill Dmitriev, who is a Russian kind of businessman who runs Russia's sovereign wealth fund. He's not a kind of security official or a foreign policy expert, but he is very much an insider. In addition to running the sovereign wealth fund, he's on the board of several big state-owned corporations, including things like Gazprom Bank. Now, although he isn't a foreign policy kind of decision maker or expert, he has had a slight foreign policy role in the past. He served as one interlocutor and kind of unofficial envoy to feel out the first Trump administration in 2017. He had a somewhat publicized meeting with Eric Prince on behalf of Trump in the United Arab Emirates. There's a bit that we're going to want to say about him and his involvement, but first we're going to go over what's actually covered by this proposal. Now, one major sticking point that differs from previous proposals that the Ukrainians have considered agreeing to and that the Americans have been willing to back is that it requires the Ukrainians to cede all of Donetsk province, including a substantial area of it, which, one, the Russians have not successfully conquered through military activities, and two, are going to be very difficult targets for Russian military advances. The cities of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk particularly are key linchpins of Ukrainian defenses on the kind of eastern front and would be very difficult for the Russians to take, especially in anything resembling a kind of reasonable time frame. Now, officially ceding this land would require a referendum in Ukraine per their constitution. With that said, this agreement would not require formally ceding the territories, just accepting kind of de facto loss of them and handing over effective control of them to the Russians. Further key points include giving up any chance of joining NATO in the future, although the deal would leave open the option of potential European Union membership, and accepting a limit on the armed forces of Ukraine to 600,000 personnel. Now, before the war, Ukraine was quite a bit under this number. Now they're quite a bit over it. There's also a little bit about investing some seized Russian assets in European banks into reconstructing Ukraine and kind of investing into Ukraine's economy, with an odd clause about how the United States would receive some of the profits from that. Now, people who were paying attention to the peace process in the spring may remember this proposed mineral deal. Under the Trump administration, America has been making repeated attempts to extract wealth from the peace negotiation process in a variety of unusual ways. But here's the thing. There are technically 3 peace proposals. There's another one, which comes from the Europeans and makes some changes, including increasing the restriction on military size to 800,000 personnel, and leaving NATO membership on the table. But the other noteworthy proposal is actually a Ukrainian-American proposal. Now, after negotiating this proposal with the Russians, a US kind of delegation met with both the Russians and the Ukrainians, separately mind you, in the United Arab Emirates on the 25th of November. During this meeting, the United States delegation and the Ukrainian delegation agreed on an altered version of the proposal. Now, theoretically, and the Americans seem to think, at least publicly, that the proposal is pretty much the same with a few kind of detailed changes, but it's really an entirely separate proposal. Now, the Trump administration has said, I'm going to quote here, there are some minor details to be sorted out, but they have agreed to a peace deal with regards to the Ukrainian counterproposal they've negotiated with the Americans. Now, the thing is that the counterproposal, which the Ukrainians have agreed to, is extremely different. It involves not ceding Donetsk, and it involves much more specific kind of security guarantees from Western countries than the vague kind of concept of security guarantees that the Russian proposal alludes to, but specifically rules out NATO membership. Now, the Ukrainian proposal also removes a provision in the Russian proposal about universal kind of amnesty for war crimes. But the biggest thing is the refusal to cede Donetsk and to agree essentially to giving up kind of crucial security guarantees with regards to literal security guarantees and also army size. So the meeting has been described extremely positively by both the Americans and the Ukrainians. But the reason that they had such a good meeting is because they didn't take into account actually needing to get Russia to agree to this deal. The whole thing is kind of a nothing. The Russians have already kind of subtly expressed that a deal like this will be unacceptable. Putin has said, and the Russian Foreign Ministry has said, that they are open to a deal, but only if it follows the framework agreed between the Americans and the Russians during the meeting between Putin and Trump in Alaska. Now, that understanding was fairly similar to the proposal that the Russians and Americans agreed to, but it's a long way off from the Ukrainian-American proposal. Now, at this point, it's also questionable whether the Russians actually would be willing to accept the deal that was agreed between Witkoff and Dmitriev. We'll get into this a little bit later, but it's questionable the degree to which Dmitriev is actually acting as an agent of Putin directly, and with Putin's kind of blessing and direct instructions on what is and isn't acceptable. But beyond that, Putin's been pretty clear in his public appearances, at least, that he feels very happy with how the war is going right now, and he doesn't see necessarily a need for a ceasefire or a peace deal. Right now, it looks like the Russians would be much more likely to accept no peace than a peace which they don't feel gives them everything that they want. And Putin has already turned down one very advantageous ceasefire deal, which I think most people looking at the situation now would probably argue, and I would certainly argue, from a strategic perspective, he really should have agreed to. Now, as for the Ukrainians, right now, the Ukrainians would be decently happy with kind of their peace proposal. It's not anywhere near what Ukraine was hoping for, and it's a long way off from their maximalist goals. But given the not catastrophic by any means, but suboptimal situation on the battlefield and the kind of frustration with inconsistencies in Washington's position and European inabilities to provide serious support that is consistently reliable, the Ukrainians would probably be quite pleased to be able to get a peace agreement like that with no kind of major concessions politically and only territorial concessions that are already essentially cemented by the situation on the battlefield. Now, the Russian proposal is a different question. It's fairly plausible that the Ukrainians could accept it if the situation on the battlefield was to turn more against them, but there are many points that would be problematic. Most of all, the ceding of territories that the Russians do not yet occupy, particularly very strategically valuable and defensible positions in Donetsk, but also the question of sovereignty. Now, the Russian proposal affirms Ukrainian sovereignty in pretty clear language. The issue is that the proposal also undermines it very strongly. The military limit of 600,000 troops, particularly in this regard, is quite damning for the proposal. Now, the military implications of that are fairly minor. The Ukrainians are not going to be maintaining an army larger than 600,000 personnel in peacetime, even wary of the Russians as they will be. It's not militarily or economically practical. It would not be advantageous. And they just can't do it if they want to get their country back on their feet. It's not a major sticking point militarily. But to have limits on your army size set by the country that you've just been at war with is a major blow to sovereignty and kind of undermines a lot of what the Ukrainians feel they've been fighting for. So selling that politically would be incredibly difficult for Zelensky and his administration. Now, that raises the question of what would happen if Ukraine was forced to accept either the current Russian proposal or something along a similar model in the near future. And I think that would open up a very concerning path for Ukraine that Putin is probably looking for and aiming for. And that's essentially resulting in something kind of like what we see in modern Georgia in the aftermath of the 2008 Russo Georgian War. Now, right now, Ukraine has some very severe issues, particularly with regards to corruption. But it is very important to acknowledge how well Ukraine is doing with progressing on these issues, thanks largely to a lot of kind of strong sentiment and impressive work by civil society. And to be very clear, not at all thanks to the presidential administration, including Zelensky, who have been involved in some very questionable things, both with regards to the recent energy scandal and the attempt to undermine the independence of the anti corruption agencies, but also numerous other smaller things prior to that. Now, Ukrainian kind of civil society desire to join the West, desire to make progress in these areas has been incredibly positive as an influence on the country over the past years, and is one of the things that provides kind of the most hope for Ukraine's future and where the country is going. Now, if the war produced kind of a politically unacceptable and essentially demoralizing would be the main issue, a demoralizing result, which left kind of many Ukrainians feeling that they got screwed by the Americans and the Europeans and by their own government, and that they put all that effort into surviving the war, into all of this fighting, with everybody kind of scraping and sacrificing for the war, while these energy ministers and such are stealing colossal amounts of money and showing nothing but contempt for the Ukrainian population. You could easily see a sort of disenchantment with the kind of path that Ukraine has been on, and which Ukrainian civil society has been very much attempting to push the country along, largely quite successfully, though change is, of course, not fast or instant. It is very much happening and going in a very positive direction. Now, this could easily turn around in the event of a demoralizing, disenchanting peace settlement. And to be clear, Ukraine is already facing a very difficult process post war, not only with regards to the territories that they are inevitably going to lose, and with regards to the demobilization process for a very significant army given the country's size, but also with regards to making progress on corruption and the kind of move to join Europe, which has been one of the core aspects of Ukrainian policy since 2014. Now, one of Putin's goals with a peace settlement will be to undermine the ability of Ukraine to function as a successful state and to make progress towards the West. Now, this peace settlement seems, in my opinion, decently effectively aimed at demoralizing the Ukrainian population and essentially turning Ukraine into a dysfunctional state which cannot really integrate with the West, cannot meaningfully develop in the direction it's attempting to develop, and thus will fall back into corruption, depoliticization, and these patterns that will allow Russia to wield significant influence and essentially keep the country, in some sense, in kind of the Russian sphere of influence, even as the culture and the polity remain deeply hostile to Russia. In essence, the Russians do not need Kiev to be friendly or positive towards them if the major figures of the Ukrainian government are easily bribable to do what the Russians want. Now, I don't think this is necessarily the most likely outcome, but I think it is a significantly dangerous outcome which has a good chance of coming to pass in the event of a peace plan being accepted, or one like this. Not necessarily this one, but one like this. Now, the Ukrainian peace plan at this point is going to be unacceptable to Russia. There is next to no chance they will agree to it. I don't think that the Ukrainians are yet at a point where they're going to be accepting the Russian proposal, but it's not implausible in the medium term that that could be something that they're going to feel they have to do. And at such a point, the scenario that I've described is, I think, a real and present danger. Now I want to take a step back from that and take a moment to discuss two things about the principal negotiators behind the American-Russian proposal. First of all, Steve Witkoff. I think it's been pretty evident to most people observing the situation that he's a little bit out of his depth in international diplomacy. In the Russia-Ukraine case particularly, he has floundered, he has achieved essentially nothing of consequence, and he's made some kind of critical missteps in terms of setting up meetings that did not go the way people were planning for them to go due to essentially poor communication. The Russians and the Americans went into the Alaska meeting with different ideas about what was already kind of pre-agreed on and what the different positions of the parties were. And these ideas turned out not to be entirely accurate, so the meeting was not particularly successful. Now, with regards to more recent events, there was also this leaked transcript of a phone conversation recently in Bloomberg between Witkoff and Putin's aide to the president on foreign affairs, Yuri Ushakov, who's one of kind of the main people who influences Putin on matters of foreign policy. And Ushakov is very much central to Putin's kind of foreign policy team, particularly with regards to the United States. He's, I think we can safely say, probably got more of an influence by quite a bit on foreign policy decision making within Russia than the actual foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. And now we've just seen this leaked phone conversation transcript between Ushakov and Witkoff, which essentially depicts Witkoff attempting to coach or advise Ushakov on how Putin can approach Trump to get a more positive reaction, and essentially how Putin can persuade Trump around to his proposal. Now, what I'm getting at here is I'm attempting to illustrate the degree of unprofessionalism, and in this area, frankly, incompetence that defines Witkoff's involvement in foreign affairs. Now, when we take this into account, the degree of mess that we've seen around these proposals and the kind of American endorsing of completely incompatible Ukrainian and Russian peace proposals starts to make a little bit more sense. It's primarily a matter of the fact that the guy who's running the show here for the Americans is just incredibly out of his depth. Now, the last thing that I want to touch on before we wrap up is Russian internal political dynamics and how that relates to Kirill Dmitriev and his role in the negotiation of this proposal, and what that means for Russian acceptance or non-acceptance. Now, one defining quality of the way that the current Russian political system operates is that Putin often essentially outsources his job. He lets other people compete for his favor by attempting to figure out what he wants and then doing it in an attempt to win his attention and his approval. Often, I think, in cases where he might not necessarily even know what he wants until he kind of looks at what's being done. So Putin rules by letting other people compete to try to figure out what he wants, and then rewarding and supporting those who kind of get results or do the things that he wants, and supporting essentially the ideas and the actions that work for him. So he's not necessarily being proactive. He's having other people in his circles who are being proactive, and then he reacts to them. Now, the relevance of that to this case is that I think it's quite likely, not guaranteed to be clear, but quite likely that Putin wasn't particularly involved in this process. That Dmitriev looked at the situation and said, okay, I think the boss would like if I could do this, so I'm going to try it, and then if it works out, I'll get rewarded. And that means that it's not necessarily guaranteed that Russia will accept its own proposal, because it didn't actually come from Putin. So while this proposal, the Russian American proposal, is a very distinctly Russian proposal, it's not necessarily guaranteed that the Russians will accept it, and it probably isn't a Putin proposal. And it's also worth noting that being primarily a man involved in business and economics, Dmitriev is probably quite a bit more interested in a swift end to the war and economic reintegration than Putin is. But that right now is very much an academic question, because the point at where we're at is that the United States appears to be backing two separate peace proposals, one they've negotiated with the Russians and one they've negotiated with the Ukrainians, which are very far apart, and the agreements that the Americans have negotiated that they're very proud of in public and say are essentially the same, differ on most of the key issues that have prevented kind of a peace settlement up until this point. Almost every key disagreement that has still been present from the beginning remains present and has not been addressed by these two proposals. So this has actually done almost nothing to bring the two sides closer to an agreement. All that's really happened here is that we've laid out essentially war-ending conditions that the Ukrainians find potentially acceptable and war-ending conditions that the Russians find potentially acceptable. And these conditions are obviously still very different. And this process of negotiations has really just shown off how different they are and how incapable the current American administration is of not only bringing the two proposals together, but also recognizing where the two sides stand right now. In backing these two proposals, the American diplomatic effort is achieving nothing right now because it's treating the disagreements between these two proposals as small details when they really get to the core of what a peace agreement would need to reckon with. The disagreements are not minor details. They are, currently at least, absolutely fundamental. And this has been a discussion of the proposed peace agreements with regards to the Ukraine war. Thank you very much for listening, and have a nice day.